Hi guys, what's going on, and welcome back to another episode of Total War Arena. So, a bit of a different video we've got for you today, looking today at positive and negative ground effect modifiers. Sort of how they work, how different terrain types affect different units, you know, from heavy infantry to light infantry, to cavalry to archers, and the different effects they have on your sort of mobility, weapon damage, etc, etc, and what you should be and shouldn't be avoiding as a unit, and then also how certain commander abilities affect positive and negative ground effect modifiers for the good and for the bad. So we're going to be hopping into a training room to take a look at this, so I shall see you all in the battle. So we are loaded into our training room with our Carthaginian Tier 7 Libyan infantry. I picked these guys because they're a heavy infantry and they kind of do quite well to demonstrate my points on positive and negative ground effect modifiers. So we have spawned in here on the road. Now heavy infantry are the only class that get real strong road benefits. Almost all units will get some movement speed bonus, but only heavy infantry get attack bonus while fighting on roads. It's actually quite a lot. 20% melee defense, 20% melee attack, as well as a 9% movement speed bonus. It's actually really quite significant. You know, it puts their melee attack at 157 straight from the off. It's almost the same as like having a defiance activated at this tier. So it's effectively the same for, you know, Roman heavy infantry, Carthaginian heavy infantry like these guys, as barbarians being in the forest, you know, the light infantry equivalent. So that's where understanding where these positive ground effect modifiers can have a really big effect. You know, the big difference between fighting here and, say, if we move, you know, a little bit over this way, suddenly we'll come off the road and, you know, our melee attack drops 20-30 points, which is a lot when we're dealing with this sort of situation. So with that in mind, now let's head over to forest to see the other side of it. And it's worth noting that that is only on the heavy infantry unit class that get these road bonuses. So that will be things like the Roman armoured legionaries at tier 6 and vet tetri. But then the Roman normal legionaries, which are classed as a medium infantry unit, would not be getting that road bonus. So it's really kind of critical to understand not only what of your units are going to be getting positive ground effect modifiers by things like roads and forests for light infantry, but also what units you're fighting. Because, you know, tackling some Roman infantry while they're on the road, you're making it significantly harder for yourself fighting them if they're going to get a 20% melee attack and defense bonus. That is a significant amount, particularly once you get multiplied with something like Vengeance or Sulla's Whip, something like that as well. It makes it very tough. So, however, the twist side of heavy infantry is that when we move into a forest here, we're going to see that we get some really negative modifiers. So not only do we get the horrific movement speed, we also get minus 20% melee attack and minus 20% melee defense. So basically the exact opposite of the roads. So you can start to see how this works, how these different terrain effects affect your different units. However, we can actually influence these terrain effects. Now this is where most people perhaps, or not most people, but some people perhaps don't necessarily understand or have missed how different abilities affect different terrains. So for example, the Carthaginians, which is why I picked these guys, get a minus 50% negative ground effect modifier in the form of determination. So if we look at these guys now, their melee attack is 105, things like movement speed is down to 3, pretty slow, and their melee attack as well as their melee defense has been quite drastically reduced. And if you're fighting barbarian infantry who are getting a 25% melee attack and melee defense bonus, then suddenly you're really going to be on the back foot. However, as soon as we activate determination, our melee attack shoots back up because we are reducing the negative effect of those ground resistances, and look, our speed has moved up significantly as well. And a lot of people don't necessarily realise the effects these has, because people will look at this attack and think, oh, the melee attack goes up and the melee defense goes up, which obviously, as we see, which is why the melee attack shot up so much. But it's also because we're now only getting a 10% forest negative modifier effectively, whereas before it was minus 20. That's why our movement speed shot up. You know, determination doesn't talk about movement speed in any way, yet that added almost 0.7 movement speed to us because it's reducing 50% of the negative modifiers these forests is putting on us, which is a 30% movement speed modifier. So when we activate determination, that goes from a 30% movement speed modifier to a 15% movement speed modifier. So you can see sort of the big difference that these abilities can have. I mean, obviously as heavy infantry you shouldn't be in the forest, you should not. But sometimes it happens, sometimes you're forced into there due to situations, you get cornered, you know, or sometimes you just have to chase a unit, etc, etc, and you get forced into these situations. And knowing what abilities you have and, you know, what effects some of these positive and negative ground effect modifier changes have is really quite important. So that was heavy infantry. We're going to flick over now to archers, which is kind of another one of those misconceptions people get a bit confused about in terms of missile weapon damage and how that impacts in terms of forests. So I shall see you in the next training room. So we have loaded into the battle in our little training room. Special thanks to Ferocity here, who's giving me a hand getting this organised. So most people are aware when they've looked at their archers in a forest like this unit here, that they will have seen the forest icon. And while I'm getting the positive melee attack and defense, which is irrelevant for an archer because it's a light infantry unit, they'll notice that the missile weapon damage is minus 10% and the missile weapon range is also minus 10%. And as a consequence of that, if I now were to look at my stats here, we'll see my missile weapon damage is a bit low at 150. And if I now fire just a volley, we'll see we're doing actually pretty low amounts of damage, not really a lot there. Yet if we pick my higher damage units, these units are out of the side of the forest and actually have a higher weapon damage. You can see it's 166 compared to 150, so they're getting 16 more damage per arrow hit potentially. Although we may actually find that the damage frontal arm resistance of these Romans is actually sufficiently high. Although actually no, we were getting a little bit more damage per hit there. So a lot of people then don't understand that these Romans are not receiving less damage because they are in a forest. They are only receiving less damage if the offending archers are in the forest. So these guys are being stood on the edge of the forest, get none of the negative missile damage or missile range effects that are associated with this unit here stood in the forest. So by merely being in a forest, these Romans are actually no safer at all than if they were just stood on the open ground out here, because the missile damage reduction that is associated with being in a forest, you know, it's the same for the Romans, 10% missile weapon damage, 10% missile range, is affecting that unit only. It's not actually affecting the missiles themselves. So these units, by being stood outside the forest, are not receiving any of the negative missile effects. So these are doing full damage, and it doesn't matter if these guys are shooting at someone in the forest or someone outside of the forest. And then conversely, it's the same for this unit stood inside the forest. It doesn't matter if these guys are shooting at the Romans here, you know, these are going to have 10% less damage. It doesn't matter if they're shooting at them or if they're shooting at just some falxmen who are stood out wide in the open. They're still going to be doing 10% less damage because they are stood in a forest. So that's kind of my point. The terrain type only ever affects that specific unit. It doesn't affect the actions of another unit. And I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions, is that you would take reduced damage from archers by being in a forest. That's not the case. It's only the case when those archers that are shooting at you are also in the forest. So that's kind of what I wanted to prove with that one. So I think we're going to hop into just a little bit of a real life example now, and do a live battle with some barbarian infantry, and just quickly show you some of the positive ground effect buffs that you can get with things like Iron Discipline and stuff like that. So I shall see you in the next little event. So now we've been in the training room, we can come back to a real world example. So looking at the barbarian light infantry, and it's not just barbarians who get these strong forest bonuses, you know, the 25% melee defense, 25% melee attack, and a bit of charge impact bonus as well. It classes for any light infantry. So a good example with that would be, say, like the Roman tier 6 premium unit, the gladiators, are also a unit that gets such an ability. And we can expand on this using things like some commando abilities, which give things like 10% positive ground effect modifier. You'll see, look at our melee attack is currently 130. If we activate Iron Discipline, our melee attack gets better because we're adding 10% onto that already positive ground effect modifier. So we can exacerbate our already positive effects by using certain abilities. So while it looks like Iron Discipline doesn't really add a lot, most people would just dismiss things such as 10% positive ground effect modifier as just an irrelevant thing, but it actually does a lot more than you know, just the unbreakable. It's, you know, it's giving you melee attack and more melee defense as well, which is kind of what makes this quite a powerful ability. So hopefully those sort of couple of clips give you a bit of an insight into some of the different situations where terrain can affect different units, different unit types, heavy infantry, medium infantry, light infantry, and sort of how that can play out across the battlefield and actually make quite significant differences to the stats of different units. And then how you can modify some of that with some of your own unit abilities like determination, etc., as we showed in the clips. Yeah, not quite sure where this came from as a video idea. I think someone might have mentioned it in a comment once, and I thought it was actually quite a good idea. Something that I know it took me a while to figure out what was going on in the game for this part. So, yeah, maybe it'll help some of you newer players who have just recently joined us. Yeah, so let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. If you have any questions about anything surrounding this or anything else, let me know in the comments down below. I'll be happy to answer them. Yeah, subscribe to the channel for lots more Total War Arena content, and I shall see you all on the next video.